Welcome to Growing with the Stars. I am Katie, your resident astrologer, and this is Kat.
And I am here participating in our little, not little, I guess, large dive into history from an astrological perspective, um, going into, I believe, the medieval period at this point.
Yeah, so if you just joined us, we are doing a little history deep dive into looking at astrological trends in Jewish history. So check out part one for more ancient history, where we get into the fall of some of the temples, including the fall of the Second Temple. We get into a little bit of Roman emperors as well. And the main TLDR, the trends that we're starting to see in sort of what I would call sort of the primary or major moments in sort of Jewish social political life, um, is that we are seeing cardinal T squares, particularly with outer planets. We're talking like Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, but a little bit as well with Saturn and Jupiter. And it means that these planets are in really activating hard angles of squares and oppositions. And we also see eclipses, sometimes really activating or sort of triggering a momentous event before these aspects. Finally, the thing that we're also seeing is especially Pluto and Aquarius and a little bit with Saturn and Libra, being really momentous periods of general changes in sort of the rise or fall of sort of Jewish political and social power. But it's not really indicating which way it is going, at least at this point. So that's the summary. That's the Cliff Notes. And today I want to take us to the next era, which is the medieval period. And as a European Jewish astrologer or European American, uh, I wanted to highlight that we are going to be focusing on European Jewish history because that is what I really know and can speak to. This isn't supposed to be the be all and end all, but sort of an introductory exploration for other astrologers, especially other Jewish astrologers, to dive into and do more research so that as we have a better understanding of the astrological trends, we can make better predictions for the world and especially for things coming up because the trends never end. Unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you like to view it. So, when we get into the medieval era, we're going to start with a major moment, which is the beginning of the Crusades. So we're already at the end of the 11th century, trying to do math, so around 1095. And this is when the Pope at the time calls for a crusade to take over the Holy Land. And what he's not really prepared for is the religious fervor and interest, especially from the working classes. We're talking peasants and largely less educated people within Europe willing to pick up arms and get on with it. So I want you to imagine there is an army of somewhere around 20,000 people wandering through Europe towards, from the west to the east. They're going to go through Constantinople and eventually towards Jerusalem. They're not well trained. This is not a well trained, efficient army. And these people have been largely taught that Jesus was killed by Jews. As a Jewish person, this is very difficult, but the real text, if you want to take a look at it, is like Matthew 27, I believe, where there's this whole period where Jesus has been taken in by the authorities and Roman authorities, and you have Jewish elders who are trying to egg on the people to get Jesus, crucified. And so Pontius Pilate kind of comes across in the text as this guy that really doesn't want to kill him. He wants to give him up, but the people won't let him, and that they demand that he sacrifice him or crucify him. And um, the text has like the people in the crowd at one point say, his blood is on us and on our children. And this text becomes really important for just general anti-Semitism against Jews, particularly in very Christian Europe. During the People's Crusade, which sort of is the precursor to the First Crusade, they go through Germany, particularly through the Rhineland, where there is was a large Jewish community existing, and there's a lot of violence. We're talking something like anywhere from 2 to 12,000 Jews were killed over a 6 month period. And during this, people were forced to convert to Christianity. Many were obviously killed, but they were stolen from. We see people choosing to self-select out, if you will, rather than face those violent actions. And people were very traumatized by this. Um, Understandably so. And entire communities are essentially gone after this. And so, if you needed an image of this, I want you to think of like a small football stadium, something that can hold thousands of people. And I want you to imagine an army like that moving through your landscape and not feeling safe, not knowing what they're going to do to you, to your family. You don't know if you're going to be able to have a living afterwards because they were also kind of taking resources, taking food, taking items as they went. It was very chaotic. And so this is clearly incredibly devastating for European Jews. So the question is, okay, what's the astrology of this? Is there an astrology of this? And we do have the Council of Claremont, which is happening about 6 months prior to the People's Crusade. And this is where we get the real call for going to the Holy Land, where we get the real idea very publicly of the Crusade. And we have the date of when this Council of Claremont started. We know the Council of Claremont started or was kicked off November 18th, 1095. We have adjusted the chart for the delights of time, which is a lot of these dates are in the Julian, and we are now in the Gregorian. And so I had to adjust some of this to make sure we got the appropriate data. But this is a chart for the day of the the council convening. Once again, we are seeing some patterns, right? The first thing to notice, we've got lots of outer planets in cardinal signs. We've got Uranus at the tail end or the last third of Aries. We have Neptune at 29 Cancer and Jupiter up at 20 Capricorn. So this is a loose T square, especially that day that the council was starting. We also have the moon coming through. And so I think I've said this before, but we often see with major events that you'll see outer planets like Neptune, Uranus, even Jupiter loosely within aspect of each other for a while. And then another planet comes in and acts like a trigger planet, something that's faster moving to sort of be the catalyst. In this case, it looks like the moon in its own sign of Cancer was doing that, really launching this grand, I always want to say grand cross. It is not a grand cross. This is a T square. I think also the cardinal signs in this case are really interesting. We see this sort of surprising shift and initiation around war, right? A crusade is ultimately, right, a war. They're trying to reclaim Jerusalem for the Christians. You also see this Jupiter doesn't do super well in Capricorn. This is the place where Jupiter is in fall. It sort of is kind of harsh. It's struggling. And so there's this sort of feeling of like what is abundant, what is resources, what is wealth, and also kind of Jupiter has a lot of religious aspects and connotations. And so kind of religion being in a place of extremes and having a raggedness to it, that it's sort of part of planets in fall are they go in they don't have any sort of balance or equilibrium. They go from extreme to another. And so we see that extreme sort of come up in sort of extreme religious violence. And you know, sometimes with Cancer, the sign of Cancer, we see things around the other, who is home, who is safe, and who is the other, and sort of xenophobia can come up here as well. And I think we might be seeing, right, the darkness of that as well coming through this. So there's just some things to kind of keep in mind as we're looking at the overall picture. The final thing I will say um, is we have a really tight trine between Mars. We have a grand fire trine actually between Mars, Uranus, and Mercury in this chart, which is a little different. Grand trines aren't something that are really common so far in what we've done, but Mars and Uranus together are chaos goblins. So once again, we see more conflict, more heat being added to the fire, and we see this very Mercury in Sagittarius is very much like willing to go the grand distance for a specific overarching truth. So once again, we're seeing sort of communication, information being played into for the violence, for that, and the harshness of what it might mean for the other in this case, or in, whether you were, I mean, the Crusades were really bad for the Jews, they were bad for the Muslims, they were bad for anyone that they deemed different from them. And I
I
think that's baked in
remember,
this chart.
oh,
Sorry.
sorry. No, I was going to say, I remember you saying that Mars and Uranus are chaos goblins last time. So is that, what did that happen? And were you talking about that? Did that happen before on
I'd have to
another?
look. I think they did. That might have been the fall of the second temple. I'm just pulling that up really quickly from my notes. Yeah, so I'm going to show you this is the fall of the second temple. So this is over 1,000 years prior, right? This is 70 CE. And what we see in this chart, Uranus and Mars are in what's called a sextile. It's a smaller aspect, but they are working together. So once again, the amplification, particularly around things like violence and sudden change, are working well. The metaphor I usually give for Mars and Uranus is like, what if we had a whole entire tank of gasoline and Mars likes to play with matches? Together, big things happen, and you don't always know which way that's going to go. They aren't exactly known for being super in control of what they do.
I'm proud of myself for remembering that from the first, the
That
first
that's
one.
impressive. I didn't remember it. Oh my goodness. So, as you might know, the Middle Ages go on. It's not a great time typically in Europe to be a Jew. There are, and now before we get in the comments, yes, there are caveats for times and places, and like we're talking a wide swath with overarching big brush. So, like, yes, it's not a monolith, but by by the 13th century, uh, 1215, we see a really important moment called the Fourth Lateran Council. You might be like, Katie, why are you spending so much time with the Vatican? The Vatican was a big deal. I know the Vatican right now is like a purely kind of religious body, but like that was not the Vatican in the medieval era. It was a real political, social power throughout Europe and had huge amounts of sway. We cannot understand a lot of the trends of Europe if we are ignoring the Vatican. And if a lot of anti-Semitism in Europe is derived from religious authority and power, the trends that the Vatican then does or the Pope leads have massive implications for Jews in Europe, and especially in the lands that the Pope ruled. The Pope literally had lands where people were subject to the Pope, particularly in like Italy, and I want to say in parts of now, like, sort of northern Italy, the kind of areas of sometimes I think of like Germany and Austria, sort of that area a little bit as well. I don't exactly remember the perfect geography, but definitely the was a major political player, at least within the Italian peninsula.
Vatican City is still not Italy. I mean, it is in Italy, but it is not like necessarily like, I don't think subject to the jurisdiction of, I'm pretty sure it's its own body.
It's its own nation. Yeah, you can get there are people that are citizens of the Vatican. They do not have Italian passports. They're separated in that way. So let's talk about the Fourth Lateran Council and why this matters. Because this is a major moment where they legalize anti-Semitism in the sense that Jews are forced to wear specific clothing and clothing markers to identify them. And this becomes something that's, kind of common. They there's much of other things that happen at this, but it becomes really important for like you can't hide in your community. There's no way like there's legalizing the othering of Jews and trying to make them really visually stand out amongst others. And so that's a key thing to keep in mind for the Jewish experience if you're living in Europe. I wish I wish I could say differently, but that's what we're dealing with.
And if you're thinking forward, just yep, you're getting there.
Oftentimes, the things that we think are innovations are really just picking up old things other people did and making it their own. So, what's the astrology for this council, right? So, the council was started, for those that are want dates, this is November 11th, 1215, and we have adjusted the chart so that we could see it because the tools I use are mostly in Gregorian because that's what we use these days. So, this is the chart for the day the council is started or brought together. And this is a cardinal cross. So what you will see is like an orange or red little square with a line down the middle and bisecting it. Um, the cross comes from it's a cross. And we have it all in the early cardinal signs. We have Venus at the top in Capricorn. We have Mars at the beginning of Aries. Once again, Uranus is involved. He is over on the right with Saturn in Libra. And the moon that day does enter Cancer, creating the Grand Cross. So even if you say, well, maybe it started at 8 a.m., right, when the moon was probably much more likely at the end of Gemini, you want to get nitpicky about it. At the minimum, we get the three, we get the T square. But that day we do also have truly a grand cross, which sort of intensifies that cardinal energy even more so. And I think what's very interesting is the outer planet players in this case are really strongly the Uranus Saturn conjunction in Libra. So let's just talk about like what that usually is about. So Uranus, we know that I love to talk about him as a chaos goblin. A chaos goblin. Uh, he is all about change, innovation, upending things. And Saturn, that's not Saturn's thing. Saturn loves consistency, stability, and Saturn does super well in Libra. Saturn is exalted here. And so what we see is maybe a sudden shift or sudden formalizing of legal things, right? How do we put into law the things that are maybe already status quo, or how do we, uh, make a thing that we're already doing maybe more rigid? So we're also seeing a mutual reception in the chart. Yeah, think of it as a home swap. Saturn is in Venus's home sign, and Venus is in Saturn's home sign. And so that is strengthening them as well. So there's a lot, I think, around tradition, formalizing things, setting rules and strictures that are really coming up here. Just something to kind of consider as we are talking about all of this. Just really fascinating to see once again, cardinal energy screaming, screaming loud that something is happening that is going to be impactful to many Jewish people and their lived experience.
And it's that cardinal energy that really keeps coming up again and again.
Yeah, yeah. Um, we see a lot of the cardinal energy, and the outer planets are in cardinal places for the most part. Neptune isn't really tightly involved, but Neptune is in Aries, something I'm watching. It's interesting seeing Pluto in Leo in this case, but uh I think that's more just because I'm really obsessed with Pluto and Aquarius and when it does show up in Jewish history. Now, the one that you might know the most about, and the one that in some ways is the loudest astrologically is the Jewish expulsion from Spain, what's often known as the Sephardic diaspora. And so these are Jews that historically are from the Iberian Peninsula. This community has been or was in Spain for about 1500 years, and it was a cultural epicenter. We see so much Jewish cultural life come out of here. I mean, we see an incredible period of poetry, translation, art. The thing that may make some Christians a little mad is you all think the medieval ages are the dark ages. But let me tell you, in the Islamic world, the Spanish peninsula throughout sort of the Mediterranean that was really, Islamic dominated or had Muslim rulers, they had access to text and lineages of information from the Greco-Roman period that the Christians would have died to have access to. They had complete books, they had better lineages of history, they had better information, science, mathematics. Like it's apples and oranges, which kind of makes Islamophobia today even more ridiculous. But that is a whole other podcast.
Well,
Mhm.
always ridiculous, but also, yeah, the amount of things that like you would think, or no, you would have been made to believe were created in one place that are actually not at all from where you would think they are. It's a great prompt to go do some reading on some history. Fantastic. I'll put a nice little book reference down in the down below there.
Yeah, please. I look forward to it. And Jews really benefited in this period. Jews were not always given the best treatment under Muslims, but they often had much better treatment than under Christian rulers, partially because Islam has better prescriptions for people of the book, which they consider Jews and Christians to be that. And we see that in the Jewish life of Spain, where we see Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah that we know today really coming from Spain in that period. But amongst other things, I mean, there's major poetry that comes out of it. There is liturgical things that there's lots of Jews like that, like myself, who still use today that are written during this time frame. But this community is decimated as we see the the Christian reconquering of the peninsula. And this really comes to a head in 1492 as King Ferdinand and Isabella reunify the peninsula and basically tell Jews that they have a certain amount of time to convert or get out. Yeah. And it's a great excuse for stealing a lot of people's money. The Spanish were wealthy for a reason, my friends, and it wasn't because of hard work. So the
On top
date,
of that, they also had like they'd be like, "Did you really convert, or are you still like secretly practicing Judaism?" And so they'd just be like, "We're just gonna take your stuff anyway. Okay, bye."
yes, there is multiple periods where that violence gets really, really intense. And yeah, you would have forced conversions, and then there was a lot of fear about the conversos. Part of why Spain is really into pork is pork became a really good identifying food to tell if you were Christian, because neither Muslims nor Jews religiously eat that food. And that is why it is so prevalent in many ways throughout Spain, because this was the food of the Christians, of the good people. And I'm a Jewish person that eats seafood. I don't really care dietarily, but like it's a tool for cultural force and domination, and that's what makes it messed up. So let's just talk about the astrology, where the we get March 31st, 1492, sort of this announcement. This is when Jews find out that they have either they got a few choices to make and none of them look great. And so this is the chart for that date. Wouldn't you know? We once again have some interesting planets involved. And it's a cardinal T square. So, first off, the trickiest is that Neptune at 29 degrees of Sagittarius. It's what I would call within orb of a cardinal T square. It's not in a cardinal sign. Sagittarius is a mutable sign, but it is within a degree of opposing Jupiter in Cancer, and they're both tightly squaring the sun, and Mars is once again involved. So we see the sun in the sign of its exaltation, we see Mars in domicile, and we have two major slower planets, Neptune and Jupiter, involved. I don't really love calling Jupiter an outer planet, but it is a slower planet. So the Jupiter-Neptune opposition had been happening, and then all of the Aries stuff comes together to really set it off. We also have, it's kind of loose, it's with 10 degrees, but Uranus is also in Capricorn, right? And that's providing somewhat of an overcoming loose square to a lot of the cardinal placements. If I had a better history understanding, I wouldn't be surprised at some of the major decision making around deciding to expel the Jews, right? Happens when, earlier within the year when, Uranus is maybe a little earlier on, but I'd have to do better research on that. We also can say that that same day, the end of that day, you do get a loose, at the end of that day, you also get the Grand Cross, right? The moon by the end of the day does hit the beginning of Libra. So there's this sort of, once again, really intense cardinal energies are happening. And we are once again seeing this really interesting tension between nationalism, who's in, who's out, the kind of taking back of the country, um, and using force, using war, using aggression to make that occur. Something we haven't really talked about with T squares like this triangle, is the apex point is the place where this sort of energy of the tension, right? The tension of this opposition, they don't see eye to eye, gets to the release. And so the tension of the homeland, nostalgia, reunification of a Christian nation, and, ideals of distance, of foreignness, we get sort of Neptune and Sagittarius as sort of like foreign places, other people, who is in, who is out also comes up. This tension is sort of resolved or finds catharsis, a solution, not a good one, but a solution through Mars, through conflict, through forcing things right through the severing and separation of people from a place.
That made a lot of sense. But okay, wow.
Yeah, I sometimes the astrology,
Thank you.
yeah, can be very literal in that sense. Mars is often a knife. It is separating things. It's separating people. And even in Aries, there is a beginning to this, right? It is beginning a diaspora that is still in existence today. The Sephardic diaspora, right, has changed where people live for 500 plus years. Significant.
I mean, it's changed the entire, I would say, I would almost say like the structure of everything to a degree.
I mean, it changed an entire Jewish community.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Um, and we will, in our next episode, talk a little bit about Israel, and sort of that was sort of the next real shift socially, politically, that made mass migration occur again. Both people choosing to be there and people being forced, people believing that was their only place to go for various reasons. But yeah, some of these major moments will leave implications that change where people live, and where they feel what is home forever. I also want to take a second and look at the royals' birth chart. And so we didn't have good charts for the popes, which is why I didn't really want to talk about them as much. But we have good ones for Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. surprisingly enough. And let's just start with Isabella. And right, these two together, it's their marriage that allows and really accelerates the final stages of Christian unification of the peninsula. Um, I believe their two kingdoms are sort of the big Christian kingdoms that allow them to kick out the last Moorish kingdom of Granada at the south. So this is Isabel. And I looked at this chart and I was like, well, wouldn't you know? Isn't that interesting? She's got a lot of cardinal energy. We see uh we see her midheaven has Uranus conjunct the midheaven in Cancer. We see her moon in Capricorn. And we see Venus very closely right in squaring both of them. It's very tight. Her Uranus and Mercury is also like the moon's approaching Mercury as well. So she's got that T square energy. It's embedded in her own chart. And a lot of it is both about her lineage, her legacy, the things she wants to leave behind, as well as her relationship, her marriage, right? The seventh house of partnership. So let's take a look at her partner. That's King Ferdinand. Uh, Interestingly enough, he's not a cardinal rising sign. I'll give you that. But he also, it's hard to see in this, but I want you to notice Venus, Mercury, Aries, opposing Saturn in Libra. And they are both loosely squaring, particularly Saturn and Mercury, his Uranus in Cancer. So both of these folks actually have very similar placements. They must be born, I think, the same year. So he's born in 1452, and she's born in 1451. So she's a year older. What a cougar. But interestingly enough, they both have the Mercury Venus in Aries in different parts of their charts, and they both have that strong cardinal square. And so I think it's very interesting that in some of these cases of the most intense moments of Jewish history, the ones that have the most pivotal things. It is not just that the pivotal energy that we're seeing is a cardinal T square. We are also seeing some of the major players that are initiating this or making this happen. In this case, the king and the queen didn't have to do shit. They didn't have to do any of this. They chose to do this. And that decision, right, highlights their own sort of potency, right? So we see the potency with the Grand Cardinal Cross or the Grand Cardinal T squares in their charts, the Grand Cardinal T square of the announcement. And, it ended an entire Jewish community. At least within that place, there's lots of those people there's a lot of those traditions that still exist, a lot of the language, Ladino, which is a mixture of Hebrew and Spanish, exists. But the rootedness into a place and a culture is gone. It has been spread out across the Middle East and North Africa and into like especially like Italy and Greece and the Ottoman Empire at the time. Oh my goodness, I'm actually realizing for Ferdinand that he has his chart is so busy it's hard to read. He has the Grand Cross. I forgot that exalted Mars and Capricorn opposing Uranus and the square. The squares go both to Uranus and the squares go to his Mars. So that's more grand stuff, more intensity happening.
More Chaos Goblin.
More Chaos Goblin. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, um, just a really interesting pattern that we're starting to see for what I would call the tier one events, right? These are not all the major events in Jewish history. Lord knows there are many that we have skipped, but for some of the real pivotal ones, we're seeing this pattern, and that pattern kind of continues.
That Mars
So,
Uranus is starting to pop everywhere.
yeah, I think that's definitely something to look into. Mars Uranus is something that generally is ignition and can be quite chaotic.
Mhm.
Now, I want to leave us in this episode on a good note, on an optimistic note, because I mean, I would not be here doing the things I'm doing, yapping on the internet, if it weren't for major changes in European history. And part of that is this thing called the Jewish emancipation. Now, throughout the medieval era, there are lots of rules and regulations on what Jews could do, where they could be, how decorated their synagogues could be. They were not treated as citizens. They were sort of second class, or they had much more reduced rights. Like they couldn't be on a jury. They couldn't like hold specific offices in government. That those kinds of things were normal. Now, eh, we're going from a period of like, people not always knowing if they were going to keep their land, keep their assets, like throughout all of the Middle Ages. We know about the Spanish expulsion. It's the most famous, but it was not the first, and it was not the last. England was ahead of them, but in 1290. Okay. So there's history here. But that didn't last in the sense that we see a major shift in political and cultural rights where people decide, specifically post-Enlightenment, to treat Jews as equal citizens, particularly under the law. And Jewish emancipation, I mean, it is hard to understand Jews' relationship to modernity without emancipation in the Western world. A lot of Jewish religious movements are reactions to emancipation, which is how much do we engage with society and what is our relationship to it. And some people went full on, that is priority, and religion and tradition is not important, or it needs to fit into modernity. And you see a lot of that with maybe more people that are secular, or some of the reform movement. There is more of a tension between like what parts do we keep and living amongst other folks. I grew up reform, like this is no hate to any of the groups that I'm talking about. And then the opposite end of the spectrum is what's called orthodoxy. We see people that are very much rejecting modernity, rejecting sort of living amongst other folks, and really trying to hold on to very strict readings of the texts and the rules and the regulations. And a lot of this comes out as Jews get emancipated, when we have the ability to decide how we want to engage with society. And this begins in France. We see, and this starts a whole wave throughout the 19th century, which is really, really fascinating. And the law is called the Emancipation of Jews, I believe, and it was passed by the Assembly on September 27, 1791. And it's considered a historic turn in Jewish legal rights. So naturally, as an astrologer, I'm like, let's go look at this chart. What's happening in the stars this day in little old Paris, France? Very, very interesting. I mean, we have a huge Libra stellium. In case you're wondering how many things are there, the sun, Jupiter, the North Node, Mercury, and Neptune are all there. And the moon entered Libra that day. We are actually on a day of a solar eclipse, right? Because the North Node is in Libra. It's a partial, but it's there. The question is like, Katie, where's the T square? Where's the T square? Because we got Saturn in Aries. You could argue the T square is with Chiron in Cancer. That I think is pushing it. Chiron is down there, Chiron is doing things. Who knows? The other argument we might be able to make, depending on what time the emancipation went through, is I'd want to look at where the ascendant is, if it was at noon, we suddenly have a Capricorn rising chart, and the ascendant suddenly turns this into a very pivotal angular square with the ascendant potentially. Not everything fits my hypothesis, and that is also okay. But I do think it's really fascinating to see the Libra stellium and the difference between this chart and the chart from the council in the 1290s, or 12:15, excuse me. I'm gonna look at my notes real quick while I remember which one I'm talking about. This chart for the emancipation of Jews is really different from the Fourth Lateran Council. So what do I mean? We see much more Libra. So we're once again seeing the law, justice, but we also see Saturn is not exalted there. Saturn's in fall in Aries. Saturn's in the opposing sign this time. So I think that's very interesting as far as legality, rights, who is raised up and who is released to consider. The other thing that I'm really watching for this chart is that Pluto in Aquarius. We once again see major pivots in rights, in this case, in a positive direction with Pluto up there back in Aquarius. So, yeah, very loud chart where we see, interestingly, a lot of cardinal energy, but maybe not the T square. And so it might be that another thing for us to consider as we do more of this is, are there other cardinal aspects like eclipses or other intense cardinal energy patterns that might also be important signifiers that I've missed? Totally
Well,
possible.
and looking like, okay, so you're talking about this. I'm looking at Mars and Uranus are like right on top of each other at this point. Okay, listen, I just keep picking up on these two little guys over there. But also, you're talking about Saturn and legality and it being in fall. So could that be like the fall of like the traditional, like the fall of the traditional to a degree, like kind of like the
Yeah.
loosening of the tradition?
So sometimes Saturn in fall is about a corruption of a thing. And it might be the one way you could read this is the corruption of an institution that has harmed Jews, right? Uh, I think we're also seeing, I mean, this whole time frame. What's really interesting if we look at 1789 in this period in France, and what's really, I think, embodied is the tension of Pluto Aquarius in a pretty tight opposition for a while, where a lot of people love to talk about Pluto and Aquarius, French Revolution, what are we doing now? Da, 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 da. And I'm like, in some ways, yes, but like I really, the more I study it, the more the Pluto Uranus opposition is just so loud in that time frame in a way that we aren't going to have right now. Pluto and Uranus are actually going to be in a really nice sextile, which is a very different vibe. What that means for us, whole other podcast. But yeah, this there's a lot of intense oppositions in this chart, some of which are outer planets or outer adjacent planets. And I think I lost track of what you were gonna say, what you were asking me.
Oh, no, that's okay. I was just you were talking about so I asked you about Saturn and you were talking about
Right.
Saturn in fall regarding legality, right, in opposition to the Libra. And
Yeah.
also, I was asking about like that representing the fall of like the traditional viewpoints of like the population, I guess the Christian population, like maybe like the fall of that more like strict old like oppressive structure that sometimes Saturn can sometimes feel like it represents like um just that very slow to go thing. Because I mean, if we look at the date that we started with, for example, versus the date that we're ending with, you know, that's an
Yeah,
awfully long time too.
absolutely. Saturn does often highlight traditions, structures in those systems. Law is also very much under Libra's domain as well. And so I think if we just look initially at everything going on in Libra, we're seeing Neptune has been here a while, reimagining the law, imagining a new kind of justice system, imagining a new balance. Libra is the scales. And we see this eclipse as really kind of initiating a major new beginning, right? Eclipses are major beginnings and major endings in cycles. And so we see all of that happening. And we see Saturn on the opposite side, sort of opposing it from a place of real struggle. Saturn does have some support in this chart, right? Saturn is in a nice trine with Uranus and Mars. And Saturn can speak to the corrosion of old things. It can, Saturn in Aries struggles because it's all about youthfulness and ideals, and sort of Saturn's the old man amongst the children here, struggling to keep up. And so what we might be seeing is the intensity of the innovation almost being in some ways hard to maintain, which is another thing we do see in France at this time, right? We see this is as we start to get into the terror and things go a little too far in the other direction. That might have something to do with Mars and Uranus, but Saturn being in fall, where it has a difficulty to help ground and stabilize it. The other piece to keep in mind is really what is within Saturn's domains as we're looking at something like this. Libra is not Saturn's domain. Libra is Venus's domain. Saturn's a loved guest in Libra. Saturn does well, but it's not Saturn's home. Saturn doesn't have control and access here. Saturn controls and access traditionally Aquarius and Capricorn. And in this chart, Pluto is under Saturn's dominion. And so, what we're probably seeing more what Saturn is doing is the struggle to innovate and support, maintain the Aquarius. It's trying to, and it gets this chart, it gets some support for the outsider, right? Saturn and Mars in a really harmonious angle. Saturn needs Mars when he's in Aries, and that stabilizes him and allows Saturn to then stabilize Pluto a little bit. Saturn's still kind of broke, but he kind of got a little, he's gotten a little bit of cash from daddy, and he can then give a little cash to Pluto. And so I think of this a lot as, how do I put this? This is, I think, a little bit more to do with crowd control, is what kind of comes up for me in the masses as these major legal things are sort of going on. And how much any of this can be really stable. This is a great important watershed moment. And we see the emancipation of Jews kick off from here and go through Europe through the 19th century, but this is not something that is one and done. This is something that's at the very beginning and is going to struggle to really be stable and informed and grounded and in the law. It's going to take more time. And I think Saturn might be also speaking to that, that like, hey, this isn't signed and sealed and permanent with this moment.
When you
But
say crowd control, can you just clarify that for me so I can make sure I understand that?
when I think of crowd control, I mean, Aquarius honestly gets a confusing rap in pop and when people talk about astrology. Part of that is the damn song from Hair in the Age of Aquarius. And like people think of Aquarius as this like time of enlightenment and people and coming together and blah, 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 blah. And like, don't even get me started on the age of whatever bullshit because that's confusing and hotly debated whether or not we even are in it, have been it, or will be in it in the next like 50 years. Aquarius is an outsider. It is the margins. It is a fixed air sign, traditionally ruled by Saturn, which is how I'm going to read it. And it's very much about people and the idea of people, but it's a distant idea of people. Big Aquarius placements are really obsessed with people, but like philosophically, and they don't want to be touchy-feely. So Pluto and Aquarius is like these really intense moments of transformation and questions around what is society and who are people and how do we understand this from an intellectual and like rigorous place. And Pluto and Aquarius periods, I think, can be really socially transformative depending on lots of other things. So if we look historically, going back to the first episode, and we go back to the rise of the Hasmonean dynasty, Pluto was in Aquarius then, right? This is, I want to say, We're looking at 167 BCE. And I'm just pulling up the chart for when we see that revolt really coming together. Interestingly enough, Pluto is again at about 20 degrees of Aquarius. Very similar to what we were seeing in the emancipation of Jews in 1791. So I think the 20-degree mark is something to keep an eye on. So we see this massive transformation of what it is and how do we organize and what is people, right? What does it mean to be groups? In this case, we see the rise of, Jews having their own royal state again. There's definitely some client state relationships that come up with Rome and others, but there's at least some modicum of self-rule and the authority of that coming from a place of being an outsider, being marginalized to having more power. And that's something that I think just tends to come up with Pluto and Aquarius. When and how it happens is really dependent on Saturn, the ruler of Aquarius. And the relationship between these, where Saturn is in the Pluto Aquarius cycle, I think really determines a lot of the outcomes of how Pluto is acting in Aquarius because Saturn is the resource provider. Saturn is the homeowner of Aquarius. And if Saturn is broke, Pluto don't got much to work with.
And I see it looks like Saturn's back in Libra in this chart also.
Saturn is back in Libra and is in a pretty strong trine to Pluto. And so I think that sort of
Yeah.
traditional power, exaltation of being raised up really speaks in this chart. Saturn is exalted and Mars is exalted. And so exaltation of raising up and being raised to an elite status, super, super common when we see planets in exaltation, either in the birth chart or in major pivotal charts like this.
Is our friend Uranus doing anything in particular that we need to be
Uranus is
tracking?
in early Aries. He and Mars are in a tight square. So once again, they are popping. They are popping. Um, they the Chaos Goblins continue to want to stir up shit.
I don't know if we wrote that stuff down in the outline or not, or if this is just one of those things that we're kind of coming across as we're talking.
We're I think we're coming across as we're talking. I mean, that's the beauty of this type of thing is the more we look at it, the more patterns we're going to start to see, the more things we're going to be able to maybe tease out and figure out. I would definitely say after my research, major cardinal energy, major cardinal activations, T squares, grand crosses, but also just major eclipses with some outer planets involved, or at least Jupiter and Saturn. Those are things I take notice of. Those to me look like major events for Jews, um, and Jewish potential for Jews. Now, where and which groups of Jews and which places is a whole other question to figure out. Next time, we're going to talk about the state of Israel, its chart, the ways that it is aligned with this trend, and the ways that it very much differs. And we're going to also look at a couple other folks that I think are important in Jewish history, both seen who are renowned and people that are infamous, to say the least. Because just because I have a hypothesis and a theory that sometimes works does not mean that it is foolproof. And I think that's important to acknowledge as well. So we're going to talk about that and we're going to try to get into a little bit of some details, some dates that I'm looking to the future and how this has already helped me identify a date that happened earlier this year in ways I wasn't ready to be right for.
Oh, that's always uncomfortable when you're like, I didn't really want to know that, but I guess I have no choice. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
I was able to predict the date when the Israel-Iran pop happened. And I did that 4 or 5 months before it happened. I knew the date something momentous was going to happen, and I was correct. And we will talk about why I got that right as well. Um, and what this means moving forward.
And if there's any other astrologers that maybe have like experience in other groups that are related, perhaps like, from like different areas that are like, hey, I've seen some like cardinal T squares going on in these charts over here in these tier one events. Like maybe shoot us a comment.
Yeah, would love to see if you've done research in any of this area, if there's things you think we should dig into. I'd love to let's chat in the comments. Hit one of us up. Maybe we'd even have you on and we'd love to kind of pick your brain a little bit and share your stuff with our small but mighty audience. I think that the more we study, the better prepared we can be for the future. And it's the tarot lady who says this. She does astrology and tarot, and I love it. It's a be prepared, not scared. And that's I think the best we can do with this sort of information.
Yep. I agree. That's I think my life motto is like hope for the best, prepare for the worst. And I say that all the time. I'm sure you've heard me say it before, but you know, it's you can never plant too many potatoes.
I love that. All right. Well, thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.